rookies are invested for far too long within North America, and it seems to be as though people are trying to coach rookies into becoming this great player as far as micro wise, but they'll never get there. And it's because micro itself is kind of an inherent raw skill, like a talent, if you will call it that. And you can only coach a player so far, but they have to have the base fundamental skills to be a great player. And so I like to make it akin to, I'm going to throw another car analogy out here. It's like modifying a Geo Metro. And for the youngins that don't fucking know, this was a 3-cylinder piece of shit car. And it was like I think it was like a 1.3 liter or something like that, very small engine. And, like you could put a fucking big Borg Warner turbo on that shit, create custom suspension with like Olin reservoirs and shit, or like a custom dog box transmission, etc., right? But it's still going to be a 3-cylinder piece of shit car. So you can't basically make it into a Lamborghini or a Ferrari, if we're just going to go with the exotic terms, right? And it's kind of like, even if you were to swap out the engine, well, you can't swap out the engine because it's like the mind of the car, right? Or in this case, right, the mind of the player. If you swap out the engine of a player, they die. So it's you can't do that. And that's exactly what coaches and teams are trying to do, essentially. So the problem is, I think, inherently, is that fundamentally teams just suck at scouting. And then it becomes a sunken cost fallacy to say that, oh, well, we've put so much into this player that, we have scouted diligently for, when really he just either climbed to rank 1 or he just went through one of the amateur tournaments. And so then you notice him from there, and all the hard work was kind of done for you. So then it becomes a sunken cost fallacy of, well, yeah, we've integrated this guy into our academy system, and then we've put him into LCS, and we've spent all this money. We should get returns for this. But instead, they just don't cut their losses and, sell the fucking stock, as it were, right? So coaching is, in fact, like modifying a car. You can't really change the platform. You can only add parts to help it. And basically a coach's job is they're there to help facilitate a player's growth. Notice the key word is facilitate, meaning that you help the player, right? But you can't make the player grow. You can't just, fucking give him mental steroids, in order to be a better player. But that is to say that they aren't necessarily responsible for that player's raw skill. You can't teach a player raw skill. You can't teach a player to be a Chovy or a Showmaker or an Abel, right? That just doesn't happen. Those players are so incredibly rare. But what you can do is you can scout properly. And so at the end of the day, I think teaching micro is way harder than teaching macro. And partly because, micro requires split decision making, and then also intense muscle memory. It's very at the moment as to when you make a micro decision, right? It happens in almost a split second, right? It doesn't last for more than a second as to where you decide to move your mouse to the left rather than to the right. And so that's something that you can't really inherently teach. And even if you can teach it to a somewhat degree, right, with player coaches and whatnot, that also hasn't been developed within the scene as well too. But on top of that, you need someone that is at a player coach level, like a player position level, that are already at a very high level, a masters player or a challenger player, to where they can actually go through maybe some laning exercises to where someone can improve their micro to at least a somewhat trackable degree in that sense. But with micro, you can actually have some time to think about your decisions, 30 seconds, sometimes even 2 minutes ahead, if we're thinking about setting up for drakes or whatnot. So there is clear amounts of time in which you can actually teach a player, like, hey, here's where you need to be on the map. This is why you need to be here at this moment, etc. And I think just inherently, there are certain positions to where they're kind of at a very disadvantaged role, right? Like ADC, I think, is the most disadvantaged role when it comes to coaching, because it is mostly just micro. It is mostly just hands, as the popular term is, right? Because they have the least amount of agency and influence on macro, but they must have a high micro, right? So it's the whole brain off mentality. So versus, you take the contrast, which is support, which is they can get away with poor micro because their micro doesn't necessarily influence the lane state as much. It does, and it certainly does help to have great micro as a support. I'm not saying that. It just has less influence than other roles when it comes to being good at micro. But macro, that's where they have a very large influence, right? With wards and maybe ward timings and where to place wards and vision coverage. And they're also able to keep track of lane states within different lanes upon the map and help the jungler out in that regard. And so, yeah, you are always going to have that trade-off when it comes to being stronger at micro versus macro and such. So I do think, this basically cannot be avoided with rookie players, and you have to have some fundamental skill. But now shifting to the other side, the veteran players, I do think veteran players do have a certain problem of maybe things going too well, so then they end up looking for a problem, right? Like this is the other side of it, to where, being a pro for too long and being kind of good for too long, you end up looking for problems that aren't there necessarily, right? Because you're always trying to improve and you're always trying to up your game. And so there's this interesting study, and I'll actually link it down below in the description, but it's called Prevalence-Induced Concept Change in Human Judgment, right? So I'll let you think about that title for a second. And it's by professors from, Harvard, New York University, and Dartmouth, I think it's called. And so basically what it means is that they found that people end up looking for problems as problems decrease. So, for instance, they did part of the study was they had participants look at just a screen or whatnot and say, okay, there are very blue dots and there are very purple dots. And they told participants to tell them which were ones that were blue, right? And so after 200 trials or something like that, they told the group that the number of blue dots may decrease, right? So very important for the language, may decrease. Which in fact was true, that they would decrease the number of blue dots. Obviously, they had a control group where they didn't decrease the blue dots. And so the group which had an actual decrease in blue dots ended up expanding their definition of what blue was, right? So now suddenly purple dots start to look blue in some instances. And so this was like pretty groundbreaking in that aspect, I think. And, another trial, I think they had human faces, and they had participants show they set it up to where it was there was aggressive looking human faces. And this was, part in subjectivity, in the sense of whoever set the test up of what looks aggressive and what doesn't look aggressive, right? We can at least assume that. But then they had the non-aggressive faces, and they did the same thing. They over time, faces that looked non-aggro turned more aggro as the original aggro faces were removed, right? The threats were removed in that sense. And so I think a lot of pro players can get into this kind of mind frame. Hooney is a perfect example of this. He looks for plays that he really shouldn't be looking for because he's already at a great state anyways, and so he just tries to greed for more in that instance. And you can think of just the inverse of all of this, right? Moving back over to rookies. There are just plenty of rookies that haven't worked out because, their initial base just wasn't good at all. I could think of Tabs, if you want to go way back in the day, right? With Elements back in 2015, I want to say. Apollo more recently, Golden Glue, Alltech. These guys were never really that greatly mechanically skilled, and so you're trying to build up their base, and like I said, you're trying to build up the Geo Metro, the 3-cylinder, the 1.3 liter, or whatever the fuck that engine is. So, and a coach basically can't help that. You can't help a poor base. So I think there's just a big difference between just plain investment in North America and investing in North American talent. I'm not saying that coaches or teams or anything shouldn't be doing that. The problem is investing in NA talent that has clearly missed the mark and has already proven that they just aren't going to be worth the squeeze at the very end of the day. So instead of wasting your time so much upon that, you can instead start to look for new rookies or talent or whatnot, right? Because obviously the joke is that NA teams hold on to these players so long, yet they still call them rookies. So I just think that is another factor that is in fact holding back North America, is that sunken cost fallacy, and the fact that they need to look for more prospects, because at the end of the day, you aren't going to get more horsepower out of that engine.